In 1980, Pan Am, the most powerful airline in history, made a decision that its board called the deal of the century. $1 billion, the largest acquisition in commercial aviation up to that point. Wall Street applauded. Analysts praised the strategic vision. The CEO declared it was the company's renaissance. 11 years later, Pan Am was dead.
Pan Am went out of business.
Pan Am has been in serious financial trouble for years.
What happened in between wasn't bad luck. It wasn't Lockerbie. It wasn't the oil crisis. It was something much simpler and much more devastating. That deal of the century was actually the most expensive mistake in aviation history. A $1 billion bet that drained the company, ignited internal conflicts, and put an empire on a collision course with collapse. And all the warning signs were there from day one.
If you're also passionate about the world of aviation, consider subscribing to the channel and supporting our team.
Founded in 1927, Pan Am pioneered international routes when commercial aviation was still in its infancy. While other companies flew within the United States, Pan Am connected continents: Miami to Buenos Aires, New York to London, San Francisco to Hong Kong. In the 1960s, Pan Am operated the world's largest fleet of long-range aircraft. It was the first company to order the Boeing 747, the jumbo jet that revolutionized commercial aviation. The 747 was expensive, enormous, but perfect for Pan Am's business model: intercontinental flights with high capacity. By 1970, Pan Am carried more international passengers than any other American airline. Its blue logo was globally recognized. Pan Am pilots were seen as the elite of aviation. The company had prestige, scale, and absolute dominance on transoceanic routes. But there was a structural problem. Pan Am never had authorization to operate domestic routes within the United States. For decades, this didn't matter. But in the 1970s, something changed. Deregulation of commercial aviation in the U.S. opened the domestic market to brutal competition. Companies like American, United, and Delta began building massive domestic networks that fed their international flights. A passenger in Dallas could fly to New York on American and from there to London, all with the same company. Pan Am, on the other hand, depended on agreements with other companies to bring passengers to its international hubs. This was inefficient, expensive, and put the company at a growing competitive disadvantage. In 1979, Pan Am's board looked at the scenario and made a decision. We need a domestic network, and fast. And then the opportunity arose. National Airlines was for sale. National Airlines was a mid-sized domestic carrier based primarily in Florida. It operated routes like Miami to Tampa, New Orleans to Houston, Miami to New York. Nothing glamorous, nothing international, but it had something Pan Am desperately wanted: authorization to operate domestic routes in the United States. In January 1980, Pan Am closed the deal. $437 million in cash, plus the assumption of National's debts. The total cost? Nearly $1 billion, equivalent to about $3.7 billion today. The board sold the acquisition as Pan Am's renaissance. The CEO at the time declared that this merger would transform the company into a true global giant with domestic reach. Market analysts praised the strategic vision. Wall Street applauded. But here's the problem. Internal documents from that time, which only came to light years later, show that several executives warned about critical incompatibilities, warnings about fleet, about corporate culture, about route profitability, about labor structure. All these warnings were ignored. Because here's the thing, Pan Am was so desperate to have a domestic network that it bought the first thing available without evaluating whether that network made any sense for the company's business model. Let's start with the fleet. National operated primarily Boeing 727s, a 3-engine medium-range aircraft perfect for domestic flights of 1 to 3 hours, efficient on short routes, relatively low operating cost for this type of operation. Pan Am, on the other hand, operated Boeing 747s, giant 4-engine aircraft designed to fly 12 hours non-stop across the Atlantic or Pacific. High operating cost, but extremely efficient on long distances with high occupancy. These are aircraft with completely opposite operational philosophies. Pan Am suddenly found itself managing two types of operations that didn't communicate with each other. Different maintenance, different pilot training, different spare parts, duplicated logistics. The cost of maintaining this complexity? Astronomical. And the routes? Here's where it gets really problematic. Most of National's routes were low profitability. Miami to Tampa, Jacksonville to New Orleans, Houston to Las Vegas. Short routes in regional markets with tight margins. Worse still, these routes barely fed Pan Am's international flights. A passenger from Tampa to Miami rarely continued to London or Paris. The connectivity, the theoretical benefit that justified the acquisition, simply didn't exist in practice. Pan Am spent $1 billion to buy a domestic network that didn't solve its strategic problem. And it still created new financial and operational problems. But wait, it gets worse. When two airlines merge, there's always an integration period. Different corporate cultures need to align, operational systems need to be unified, employees need to learn to work together.
In the Pan Am National merger, this never happened. Instead of integration, what emerged was a corporate civil war that lasted years. Pan Am pilots saw themselves as the elite of commercial aviation. They flew 747s across the Atlantic. They landed in London, Paris, Tokyo. Many had decades of experience in complex international operations. They didn't just fly planes, they were ambassadors of a global brand. And suddenly, these pilots were informed they would now also operate short domestic routes: Miami, Tampa, New Orleans, Houston, 90-minute flights on 727s. The reaction? Absolute revolt. Pan Am pilots refused to descend to the level of domestic routes. Several labor lawsuits were filed questioning the new assignments. There were documented cases of pilots who simply refused to fly certain ex-national routes. On the other side, national employees felt invaded and disrespected. Pan Am tried to impose its rigid corporate culture, its operational procedures, and its hierarchy. But National had a more informal, more regional culture. The clash was immediate. Flight attendants didn't want to work together. Maintenance teams operated in parallel systems. There were literally two groups of employees who refused to cooperate within the same company. The unions came into conflict. ALPA, the Airline Pilots Association, found itself managing two factions that barely spoke to each other. Strikes and strike threats became routine. In some months, more energy was being spent on internal disputes than on competing in the market. Now, you might be thinking, this is just a people management problem, right? With time, it resolves itself. But it didn't resolve itself, because the problem wasn't just cultural, it was structural. The merger forced people to operate in a system that didn't make operational sense. Pilots accustomed to flying 12 hours over the ocean now made 5 short flights per day. Attendants trained for luxury international service now served sodas on 90-minute flights. For years, there was no unified Pan Am. There was Pan Am versus Pan Am. And meanwhile, competitors, American, United, Delta, operated as integrated machines, gaining market share. The company was bleeding money, and much of that bleeding came from internal inefficiencies directly caused by the National acquisition. Let's get to the numbers, because this is where the true dimension of the catastrophe becomes clear. In 1980, the year of acquisition, Pan Am reported an operating loss of $18.9 million. It wasn't good, but it was manageable. The board believed the domestic network would generate enough revenue to reverse this. It didn't. In 1981, the loss jumped to $485 million. In 1982, another $485 million in losses. The company was burning money at a catastrophic rate.
Kept losing money and selling off like the hotel company and the Pacific routes.
in 1981, sold the iconic Pan Am building in New York for $400 million, one of the company's most visible symbols. What happened? Several factors combined in a perfect storm. Operating costs exploded. Between 1981 and 1985, Pan Am's costs increased more than 40%. Part of this was inflation and the oil crisis, but a significant part came from the operational complexity created by the merger. Maintaining two different fleets, two training systems, two operational cultures, all of this cost money. Pan Am assumed National's debts plus financed part of the acquisition with loans. By 1985, the company's total debt exceeded $1.2 billion. Interest payments consumed hundreds of millions annually, money that couldn't be invested in modernization, marketing, or competitiveness. The oil crisis of 1979-1980 brutally raised the cost of aviation fuel. But while other companies managed to pass on these costs or adjust their operations, Pan Am was stuck on low-margin domestic routes that couldn't absorb price increases, stuck on international flights where it faced growing competition from more efficient European and Asian companies. The company lost financial autonomy. There was no capital to invest in new, more efficient aircraft. There was no margin for errors. Each quarter became more desperate than the last. Speaking of which, Pan Am tried to react. Between 1985 and 1990, the company implemented a series of emergency measures. Sold profitable routes to other companies, reduced the fleet from 163 to 122, laid off thousands of employees, repeatedly tried to reorganize the domestic network. Nothing worked because the problem wasn't tactical, it was structural. The National acquisition had destroyed the company's financial balance before any recovery plan could take effect. Pan Am was trying to fix a sinking ship while still pumping water into it. And then, in December 1988, came the final blow. On December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockheed, Scotland. A terrorist bomb killed 270 people. It was one of the biggest tragedies in commercial aviation. The impact on Pan Am was devastating in multiple dimensions. But here's what many people don't realize. Lockheed didn't kill Pan Am. Lockheed accelerated a death that had been underway since 1980. If Pan Am had been financially healthy in 1988, it would have absorbed the impact of Lockheed. It would have implemented new security protocols, rebuilt its reputation, survived the lawsuits. Other airlines survived similar tragedies. But Pan Am wasn't healthy. It had $1.2 billion in debt, was burning hundreds of millions annually, had no capital, no flexibility, no margin to absorb any shock. Lockheed was the final blow to a body that no longer had the strength to fight. In 1991, 3 years after Lockheed, Pan Am declared bankruptcy.
Unfortunately, we simply did not have the financial strength to absorb the enormously adverse impact of these external events.
Routes were sold at desperate prices. Delta bought the transatlantic routes. United got the Latin American routes. The fleet was dismantled. Thousands of employees lost their jobs. The empire that conquered the skies disappeared. And the question that remains is, how did this happen? The story of Pan Am isn't about a tragic accident or bad luck. It's about a catastrophic corporate decision that doomed an entire company. In 1980, Pan Am's board had a correct premise. They needed a domestic network. But the execution was disastrous. Ultimately, the fall of Pan Am is a case study on how a single poorly executed strategic decision can destroy decades of brand building, market leadership, and operational excellence. It's a reminder that in the corporate world, especially in high fixed cost industries like aviation, there's no margin for billion-dollar mistakes. Pan Am could have survived the 1980s. It could have found other ways to build a domestic network, partnerships, organic growth, smaller and more focused acquisitions. But the purchase of National eliminated all these options by draining capital and destroying the company's financial structure. And that's why, decades later, when we study the history of commercial aviation, the $1 billion acquisition of National Airlines continues to be cited as one of the worst corporate decisions ever made. The empire that conquered the skies fell because it bought the wrong airline at the wrong time for the wrong price.